Chair Esquel and board members, thank you for convening this panel. Barry Nelson with the Golden State Salmon Association. Scott and I are here in person, then we'll have two speakers participating by Zoom today. My comments are really going to be pretty narrowly focused on the details of the document, especially the analysis of the voluntary agreements. We're really pleased to have a chance to finally review the board's draft analysis of the voluntary agreements. And I want to start with an opening observation. I'm going to raise a lot of concerns about the VA analysis where we think more work is needed. But the document makes it very clear that that the draft, the current VA proposal, it does not even come close to adequately addressing the critical flow issues, the flow issues you just heard about on the last couple of panels. There are many examples of that. Virtually no dry year water, lower flows on the Sacramento River in critical years. Delta exports would increase in many years under the VAs. In critical years, Delta inflows could increase, but by as little as 0.8%. Those and many other examples show that the VA proposal, frankly, right now is not a serious, not a credible proposal when it comes to adequately protecting beneficial uses, particularly fish and wildlife and recreational and commercial fishing. That said, I want to raise concerns about the VA analysis in the document in 6 areas. First of those is the overall analytical approach. And there are 3 issues there. First is the draft analysis is largely focused on whether the VA would improve the status quo. That's not the legal standard. The legal standard is adequately protecting beneficial uses. The ecosystem is collapsing. Our fishery is shut down. Slowing the rate of disaster is not the legal standard. Second, in this area, the document doesn't synthesize the benefits of the voluntary agreement. There would be some habitat restoration in that program, and very, very little in terms of flow improvements, especially in some of the more critical years. The document doesn't crosswalk between the scientific basis report, which explains the critical drivers in the estuary, and the benefits of the VA. We think that synthesis and that crosswalk between the science and the VA's program is critical to allow the board to weigh the VA's benefits and reach an overall conclusion about its credibility. And then finally, the document, with regard to analytical approach, the document doesn't include an easy to understand summary of all of the alternatives and either their relative benefits or their relative scientific credibility. And the gap, we believe, in both of those areas is enormous, comparing, for example, the VA approach to the 65% unimpaired flow approach. Second area I'd like to talk about briefly is the salmon objectives in the voluntary agreement. The VA proposal would extend the existing salmon doubling objective deadline till 2050. It would make it essentially irrelevant in this Bay Delta Plan update, given the proposed VA timeline. VA also offers a poorly defined salmon viability objectives. It's not clear exactly what viability means, but if it means something like minimum self-sustaining populations, then it sounds like just shy of extinction risk and causing listing. That approach could devastate commercial and recreational fishing. And frankly, it reads like a plan to end commercial and recreational fishing, and we're on our way in that direction. The state board, we don't believe, can adopt objectives that would essentially abandon protected, designated beneficial uses. Third approach is one I don't think we've heard enough discussion of in this forum, and that is the risks of the voluntary agreement approach overall. We've been talking about the benefits of the approach, but there are huge risks in the assumed benefits of the VA approach. There are enormous risks, for example, that the VA doesn't provide the anticipated water transfers. We've seen many examples of that in areas like level 4 refuge supplies. Enormous risks that the accounting rules which you don't have yet, have not been provided to you, the Delta accounting rules. It would determine whether the environmental water is frankly real water or not. Those accounting rules could, if they're not the right ones, if they're not done right, mean that the environmental water that the VA program is promising simply evaporate. We've seen that with the environmental water account, the CVPI B2 program. These risks aren't speculative. Defenders of Wildlife report from last year called Building Blocks examined 18 different efforts to create environmental blocks of water. This is not a new idea. We've seen many efforts in California to create environmental blocks of water. All of them have encountered significant implementation challenges. We think, in addition to the analysis you've been hearing from your staff, you also need to ask your staff to analyze the inherent risks in the VA approach through things like accounting and the risk of whether the anticipated water supply will show up or not. We think you need analysis of those risks as well. The unimpaired flow approach, we believe, is inherently less risky. Fourth, delays. We think it's important that the document really highlight the delays we've seen in habitat restoration in places like the Yola bypass. Those habitat delays could easily extend beyond the life of the proposed voluntary agreement. Finally, overall, TUCPs. The document, we don't believe adequately discusses how TUCPs will be addressed in the future and how they could undermine the potential benefits of the VA approach and, frankly, an unimpaired flow approach as well. And then last, this is not strictly an environmental analysis issue, but the VA proposal would move a lot of money from public coffers to a very small set of senior water users who have helped to shape the voluntary agreements. We don't see it as a credible environmental proposal, but it very clearly is a proposal to move a lot of public money into a very few pockets. We believe that's a policy analysis that the board should reveal to the public if you're going to seriously consider this approach. I'd like to close with two very quick comments about the fishing community and how it's addressed in the draft document. First, we don't believe that the economic analysis adequately assesses the potential impacts and benefits to the fishing community. The document the economic analysis simply assumes that things will get better and that will benefit the fishing community. The VA approach, as I've mentioned, shows very clearly that that's far from certain. We think that the board needs to analyze potential impacts to the fishing industry if an inadequate approach is adopted. And then finally, we think the document understates the economic and job benefits of the fishing community. And we'll forward some detail on that when we submit our written comments. And with that, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thank you as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Artis, as Barry said, Executive Director of Golden State Salmon Association. And thanks to the board for listening to our comments and taking that to heart, and the staff for putting out the report. And I'm here to talk about some of the kind of the big picture ideas that are happening and the sentiments that we're hearing from our fellow fishermen and women in the industry and those that are connected to it. There's really an injustice that's happening right before our very eyes. It's on the watch and control of Governor Newsom, who is allowing an environmental travesty to unfold that is interconnected to coastal towns, families, the fishing industry, and tens of thousands who are directly, indirectly, and historically linked to this state's salmon and the habitats that support our native fisheries. Right now, East Bay Mud is continuing to announce, as we heard earlier, that the McCollum River is seeing a record return of salmon this year. In contrast, current estimates of the number of adult fall run Chinook returning to the Sacramento Valley are not likely to be enough to allow fishing in 2024. Returns of adult fall run spawning fish to the upper Sacramento Valley are dismal, very dismal, far below the target of 180,000 fish that was set for the 2022 fishing season. Estimates at this time put the number of total returning fall run to the Sacramento about 70,000 to maybe 90,000 range. That's a slap in the face to every Californian and a punch to the gut for every commercial fisherman and woman, every charter boat operator, every river guide, and on and on. spring run are also in the hundreds at this point. There's a simple explanation for this and this contrast that we're seeing with record numbers versus the dismal numbers. McCollum River salmon are not exposed to the failed water policies that have led to the collapse of salmon runs elsewhere. This contrast should lead the Newsom administration to change direction on water issues. It's a giant bat signal lighting up the sky. It's a call for help that continues to go unanswered. Except we don't need a dark knight superhero. We need a leader that cares about the people and the people's natural resources, those jobs. Baby salmon from the McCollum River hatchery were not affected by the disastrous temperatures and flow conditions on the Sacramento River and were trucked around the death trap in the Delta and released near or in the ocean. As a result, they were relatively unaffected by the failed Newsom-Trump water policies that continue to be in effect today. That's directly led to record returns this year on the McCollum, but California salmon fishery cannot survive on those fish alone. We need healthy Sacramento River runs, including wild runs, for a healthy fishing industry. In the fall, winter, and spring of 2020 and 2021, salmon suffered from 3 disastrous state water management decisions that dramatically increased the impact of drought. First, salmon eggs faced overheated water because of a failure of the State Water Resources Control Board to adequately control temperature pollution from Shasta Dam. Lethally high temperatures in the Sacramento River were caused by excessive deliveries to Bureau of Reclamation agricultural customers, draining cold water from Shasta Dam prior to the spawning season. Second, the few juvenile salmon that survived faced dangerously low flows during their outmigration down the Sacramento River. To date, the Water Board has failed to set any spring outmigration flow requirements to protect those juvenile salmon. And third, any surviving salmon faced extraordinarily hostile conditions in the Delta. What we are now seeing is incredibly disheartening to many people. A closed salmon season, emergency rescue efforts that captured spring run salmon and are transported to UC Davis to protect their genetic diversity, protect them from, quote, blinking out. Transfer of salmon eggs from state hatcheries to the Coleman National Fish Hatchery because returns and egg harvests are far below targets. The Upper Sacramento has witnessed disastrous numbers this year. Only hundreds of fall run adult are returned so far, which is fewer than the number of federally protected endangered winter run Chinook salmon that also call that Upper Sacramento home. And there's whispers of an uplisting spring run salmon from threatened to endangered. And that's just in 2023. And I'm just tired of the continued bad news for salmon. I'm heartbroken from the stories I hear from parents and business owners about their struggling children and spouses who are fishermen and women, or industry employees who are out of work and struggling. A multi-billion-dollar industry with many tens of thousands of jobs are being put on notice, and it didn't need to happen. Instead, there's a continued push for voluntary agreement process that has no organization support and does not include any adequate adaptive management plan. What is needed are temperature and flow protections for salmon and additional water in critically dry years. We support the claims of our tribal and environmental justice partners who continue to point out that the voluntary agreements were developed through an exclusionary process and violate the board and the state's policies regarding tribal consultation and environmental justice. We stand behind their civil rights complaint and petition to the EPA that the Bay Delta ecological crisis harms our state's tribes and Delta communities. Now is not the time for a poorly defined salmon viability objective that the VA offers. So I'm asking Governor Newsom, now is not the time for a don't look up moment. The signal is still shining. It's brighter than ever and unanswered. Reach out to me, Scott at goldenstatesalmon.org. As per our request over a year ago, please meet with us, meet with our coalition to make sure salmon, the fishing industry, and healthy rivers in the Bay Delta are part of California's future. This is an opportunity for the Water Board and the governor to be leaders, to be those heroes for the restoration of salmon and everyone who relies on them. Thank you. Next up is, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. My name is Sarah Bates. I own and operate a commercial fishing vessel in San Francisco. I've been fishing salmon commercially for about 15 years, with the glaring exception, of course, of this 2023 season, during which all salmon fishing in California was completely closed. Our commercial and recreational fleets were pretty unprepared last fall for the devastatingly small returns of adult salmon to the Sacramento River system. Last fall, we had only 62,000 adults returning to spawn in the Sacramento, and preseason estimates were closer to 200,000 adults that we expected to see. And we were caught off guard, but in retrospect, we actually should not have been that surprised for all of the reasons that Scott just outlined. The fish that were supposed to return to the river, the fish that we were supposed to be catching never made it out of the river as juveniles in the spring of 2021. And yes, California was in a massive drought during that time, but these fish have survived drought before. What they cannot survive are the state and federal water policies that are dooming the vast majority of juveniles before they even exit the Sacramento system. And there's been a whole bunch of positive press lately about this year's huge return to the McElney hatchery, over 25,000 fish as of this week. And it looks like there's about another 10,000 fish still in the creek. And this is a bright spot for us, no doubt. We are extremely grateful for all of the work that's being done at the hatchery and in the McElney River itself. And we're really starting to understand that this hatchery has been supporting our ocean fisheries for years. And it has been masking the slow motion disaster that's occurring in Sacramento. And historically, it's the naturally spawning fall run Sacramento River fish that produce enough fish for the California ocean and river fisheries, for the Oregon River fisheries, and for killer whales as far north as Alaska. These are a keystone species that support ecosystems both in the river and in the ocean and coastal communities. And as one of the 1,000 commercial salmon permit holders in California, I absolutely rely on these fish to feed my family and pay my bills. And I know I'm just one small fishing operation, but I'm also a California small business. I support other California small businesses. I am beneficial use. I am coastal communities from Morro Bay to Crescent City. I am local food security. And right now I am just deeply sad to be witnessing what I think are the final days of this species that has been moving through the Golden Gate and the Sacramento Bay Delta system since about the time human beings started walking on two legs. And natural production of Chinook in the upper Sacramento right now is almost zero. And we've all heard these apocryphal stories about rivers so thick with salmon you can walk on their backs, and gold miners and prisoners rioting because they've only fed salmon for weeks. And this year, in the upper Sac, the unofficial count of fall run salmon reds is 109. 109 breeding pairs of adult fall run Chinook. This is a mighty population that once fed the entire West Coast. And it's a little too early to have exact numbers for the entire Sacramento system, but we are not optimistic. This is what we're looking at, a complete collapse here. And this board, the State Water Board, is the only agency with the legal authority to set the flow and temperature protections for the Sacramento fall run. The winter run and the spring run have ESA protections, but the fall run has no federal protections, at least not yet. Because despite not catching a single fish this year, despite all the financial hardship in our fleets, we're still really unlikely to meet the conservation minimum that are going to sustain the fall run at all. And the Water Board's current water standards are inadequate to meet the conservation goals absent any harvest. This is without us killing fish. You know, this is our job to kill fish. It's like all these policies are doing it for fun. At least we're doing it to eat them. At least we're doing it to feed people. And these standards do not support fisheries. And water is a public resource in California. Fish are a public resource in California. And these policies are failing California residents who are losing our access to clean water and thriving fisheries and healthy ecosystems. And this voluntary agreement process is deeply flawed, it's exclusionary, and it doesn't really offer any credible path to reverse the decline that we're seeing in the Bay Delta system right now. And if we don't adopt new standards that are supported by the science that we've heard a lot of today, I have no doubt that I am going to see salmon extinction in my lifetime. We've lost the natural stocks of Delta smelt, the green sturgeon, and the steelhead are ESA listed. This week, the state and federal petitions were filed to list the white sturgeon. The winter run is critically endangered. The CDFW is using captive breeding to maintain their genetics. We just heard about the spring run that are being captured and held at UC Davis. It's on its way to being uplisted to endangered. There are only a couple dozen breeding pairs of spring run this year. And I'm not being hyperbolic. This is not some theoretical doomsday scenario. This is happening right now. And California is a huge success story in so many ways, but salmon extinction is not a California success story. This is not a legacy that we should be proud of. And this is happening This is happening on our watch, and it's time to do something different, or it's going to be gone, because we can't say, it's trite, but it's true. This extinction really is forever. We can't take it back. We can't do better the next time. We don't get a do-over on this one. So I would like you to consider that reality when you're making this set of policy decisions. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you. And I believe the last person on this panel is Jared Davis, and he should be invited to unmute here momentarily.
Yeah, all right.
Good afternoon. We can hear you.
All right. So thank you for the opportunity to make Jared Davis. My wife and I own and operate a charter fishing boat in Sausalito, Salty Lady Sport Fishing. My business has a long history, a reputation, and a clientele that is nearly wholly specific to salmon fishing. While there are other fish in the sea, nothing really compares to salmon, and neither is table fare nor is a fish that might attract customers to my boat. Nothing compares to salmon as far as the fishing tourism industry and the coastal towns and businesses that desperately rely upon it. The focus of my comment today is on the devastating effects of current water policy on the charter fishing community. All sectors of this industry have been negatively impacted by a failed water policy, in particular the voluntary agreement process. But I can personally attest to the disastrous impact of these policies on myself and my business. While charter fishing has never been a get-rich-quick scheme and is subject to the same ebb and flood of any business, it has provided a good, honest living for myself, my counterparts in the industry. This year's federally declared disaster is different. A complete closure of our salmon season has directly hobbled my ability to maintain a viable business. Trips, customers carried, and revenue are down 80% for me overall, and obviously 100% for the salmon fishing. It is painfully obvious that this closure is a direct result of inadequate temperature and flows in our rivers to support the life cycle of the iconic salmon. The irony of an administration that touts its focus on the green agenda and environmental policy being behind water policy that is killing salmon, along with our rivers and the whole San Francisco Bay Delta estuary ecosystem, is quite frankly staggering. In the search for balance in allocation of our water resources between corporate agriculture, residential use, and environmental needs, it is pretty clear that there is a finger on the scale, and it's pretty obvious which way it is being tipped. The environment, the salmon, and the charter fishing industry are being failed by our elected representatives and their appointed boards. As the only entity with the ability to modify policies, which to date have been catastrophic to myself, my business, the charter fishing community, and the environment, I implore the Water Resources Board to consider the implications of continuing business as usual, to set flow and temperature protections for the Sacramento Fall Run Chinook, the lifeblood of salmon, fellow fishermen and women, and my family. Repeating the same failed policies is all but guaranteed to put a nail in the coffin on your watch for myself, the entire salmon fishing industry, the River Bay Delta ecosystem, and the salmon. That's all I got. Thanks again for letting me comment.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the panel's